Hello, my name is Jim Carney. I'm an assistant professor of journalism and media studies at Lehman College in the Bronx, one of the senior colleges of the City University of New York. My presentation today is a preview of a paper that I'm in the final phase of completing that draws on nearly 25 years I worked in the area of community media and public and community access TV. It was while reminiscing on the days long ago with a former colleague that I realized that I had not seen or heard a great deal about this early phase of our multi-channel universe, covering the explosion of creativity and controversy that rose out of those chaotic days. It dawned on me that many of the issues facing society, like the explosion of media production on YouTube, the unfiltered and unfettered onslaught of commentary on Twitter, and the omniscient management of our media consumption by Facebook, are questions during this era only magnified exponentially. Renewed and intensified questions swirling around the internet, social media, and artificial intelligence, and their impact on society were initially asked for the first time during the cable explosion in the 1970s and 80s. The growing pains endured in those closing decades of the 20th century, dealing with the impact and influence of user-generated content, the decline of natural gatekeepers in distribution, and the central tensions between social morals, personal privacy, and the right to free speech and expression, are a prelude to the firestorm of controversy that we've been witnessing over the past few years. The role of social media, the power of mega media conglomerates, and the struggle to regulate or at least monitor these impacts on society are now pivotal questions in the development of our society. The unprecedented onslaught of COVID-19 and the resurgence of civil unrest relating to social imbalances and racial intolerance brought these issues into stark relief. Perhaps there are lessons to be learned from those now seemingly quaint early years of the electronic soapbox. Together with my colleague, Professor Fitzgerald of Howard University, formerly of NYU, we have set out to place those days, the programming, the producers, and the societal reaction to the rapid growth of community media in context. Professor Gerald and I are in the early stages of writing a series of articles on different elements of the time period and plan to cap off the effort with a full-length documentary that showcases the programming of the era and seeks out the pioneers of controversy and comic relief from that period. This presentation today is a draft of an initial overview of the project, presenting the history and establishes the context for the project. The title is Pundits, Preachers, and Pornographers: The Evolution of Public Access TV in New York City. It was truly transformational at this point in the development of human communication. With a nod to the comic David Letterman, here are some of the top 10 highlights of the rise of it. Number 1, countless individuals create media content ranging from the absurd to the sublime. It distributes an exponential amount of information and content through unprecedented channels of communication, reaching out to people where they live and live. Number 2, the voices of the unheard, the downtrodden, and the subjugated are given a pass to have their voices heard. Unpopular and unconventional thought was an outlet to be disseminated, debated, and embraced or rejected in the light of exposure. Number 3, talented artists, performers, composers, writers, and all types of creatives have a platform to showcase their talents and share their creations for their art. Entire new art forms are based on music, spoken word, dance, multimedia, and on all forms of culture and counterculture are sprouting and growing. And speaking of counterculture, number 4, media content creators with non-traditional lifestyles and perspectives shatter taboos and have a place to proudly display their creations and share with others who, like them, historically hid in the shadows. Number 5, with it would come a fulfilled promise of widespread education, of literacy, and widespread vocational training. From preschool education to job training and simple how-to instruction, educators have found a way to reach the masses at a minimal or no cost. Number 6, it created the venue and the opportunity for the religious and devout to find a way to reach new congregations, to spread their messages of love, tolerance, and peace, and to pass the basket. Number 7, with it, the mechanics of government and public policy are raised out of the smoky back rooms run by political machines. Government waste, corruption, and incompetence are exposed to the masses through these new communication channels. The best and brightest now have a path to expose their ideas to the masses and improve society. Number 8, technical barriers to reach the masses are swept aside as new technologies, widespread training, and access to resources, once solely the domain of the rich and powerful, are gladly provided by benevolent American corporations and institutions in a free market. But unfortunately, number 9, it also provides an outlet for hate mongers to spew racist, anti-Semitic, and incendiary claims that contain exaggeration, fabrication, and outright lies. So-called facts go unchecked, reputations are ruined, and countless hours of lost productivity cut into people's lives and prosperity. And finally, number 10, pornographers who push right up to and beyond the limits of community standards and accepted levels of decency are let loose on an unsuspecting mass audience, exposing children and the innocent to obscene and perverted content. Well, what is it? It is, of course, the world of the internet and social media. But it does have a predecessor. In fact, all of the above top 10 are taken from real examples of programming created and distributed through the public access resources of the New York City cable TV franchise. But parallels between the current legal and ethical questions surrounding free speech and its dissemination during the early days of the electronic soapbox and the global soapbox abound. There is much to be learned from the lessons and the development of electronic free speech in the mid-20th century and today's questions of the responsibilities of social media companies such as Facebook and Twitter. I begin with some background. In the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, America and the world were overwhelmed with exponential growth in communication technology, accelerated by the commercial use of closed circuit or CCTV, satellite technology, the miniaturization of electronics, and an exploding worldwide economic expansion. Multi-channel service operators of television programming, or MSOs, also known as cable TV companies, engaged in a race to wire America in order to fulfill the hours of leisure time Americans started to enjoy in the mid-20th century. These delivery services of packages of entertainment and information were expanding at breakneck speed, but the creators of the packages to be distributed by these services were lagging behind. Additionally, incumbent American technologies of that era, the traditional broadcast TV networks, were doing all they could to hinder the growth of the new upstart industry. After all, broadcast TV generated massive amounts of cash, and by the end of the 1960s, had totally engaged the attention of the American people. Initially, expanded capacity permitted with the new technology presented a unique problem to cable operators. Cities like New York City, well served by the 3 national networks on 7 VHF channels, plus a handful of grainy UHF channels, poorly serving the region's ethnic communities, were slow to embrace the unprecedented abundance of 22 channels on cable TV. The only additional benefit of paying for a service that always had been free was one fledgling channel, home box office. HBO, the brainchild of cable TV pioneer Charles Dolan, grabbed movies right after their second theatrical release in those old movie neighborhood theaters. We don't have many of them anymore. And before they were shown on the big 3 broadcast networks in their evening primetime lineup. Each month, the same movies ran incessantly in a 24-hour loop on an unused cable location through high-tech cable TV boxes. Prior to the success of the Viacom MTV I Want My MTV campaign, and the proliferation of new cable networks a decade later, cable operators had to scramble to find content to place on these new, unused channels. From its inception in the 1920s, with radio broadcasting and through the rise of broadcast TV in the mid-20th century, control and lucrative licensing fees paid by broadcasters for the over-the-air frequencies had been the domain of the federal government and the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. Local municipalities had been left out of the financial bonanza created by over-the-air TV, realized by necessity that these new cable operators needed the permission and assistance of local cities, towns, and counties to run their cables over and underneath public streets. The FCC had, through a somewhat convoluted rationale, claimed limited oversight of cable TV operations in the U.S. and opened the door for local municipalities to charge cable companies licensing or franchise fees for access to the rights of way. Furthermore, the FCC first required, and after some legal challenges, simply permitted municipalities to demand givebacks and services, such as channels set aside for the use of general public, for education, and for local government use. In some cases, studios, equipment, and even manpower were demanded by municipalities from cable operators as the cost of doing business. It was the birth of public, educational, and government access, or PEG channels. Locals, counties, cities, towns, and in some cases, even entire states, like Vermont, saw these new suitors coming to town with deep pockets and rich resources. Local politicians, community leaders, arts organizations, and anyone who thought they had a message or could carry a tune saw their opportunity to be in the spotlight. After an initial burst of innovation, most public access channels across the country fell into disuse and often reverted to electronic bulletin boards. This was not the case, however, in New York City. Demand for potentially lucrative markets such as big cities and wealthy suburban communities pushed cable operators into bidding wars created by cable corporations eager to offer local leaders a wealth of cash and services for the right to dig up city streets and string coaxial lines across the city streets. The franchising wars for the outer boroughs of New York City proved to be epic. A technological irony associated with the urban topography of the island of Manhattan is that the media capital of the world has terrible TV reception. Traditional broadcast television signals were unable to snake through the caverns of concrete and steel to provide a stable TV picture. Often, there was no signal at all. Reception with traditional TV rabbit ears antennae below the few upper floors of apartment buildings was virtually non-existent. Flat brown wires like flapping vines growing up the sides of pre-war 5-story walk-up and tenement buildings leading to roof antenna were common in every Manhattan residential neighborhood. For this reason, cable TV demand on the island of Manhattan arrived decades before the flatter outer boroughs, better served by broadcast TV, demanded it. Two cable TV operators, Sterling Manhattan Cable, later Manhattan Cable, which served downtown, and Teleprompter Manhattan, serving uptown, were home to two of the original public access operations. PEG access, public educational and government channels, could be demanded by municipalities as the cost of doing business in a given franchise. In Manhattan, and later the outer boroughs, the anticipated demand for public access, coupled with the desire on the part of city officials to gain their own channels, and for channels to be given over to the City University of New York for education, resulted in the splitting of PEG into three distinct groups of channels. 3 channels were set aside for public access, 2 free and 1 commercial for leased access use by budding entrepreneurs. 1 educational channel was administered by CUNY, the City University of New York, and the government channel, Crosswalks TV, was assigned to the New York City Mayor's office. The founding concept of public access lies in the free speech tenets of the First Amendment to the Constitution. The principle of the electronic soapbox was originally coined by Congress in reference to the establishment of the Public Broadcasting System, or PBS, in the 1960s to address the vast wasteland of broadcast TV programming by the commercial broadcasters. Unfortunately, the limitations of entry into being included on broadcast TV lineups proved to be no different for non-commercial TV. Access to resources to create programming and extremely limited amounts of airtime slots in broadcast markets soon forced PBS into an elite educational network supported by corporations. This left the common man once again out in the cold. Public access could prove to be the new, much more democratic electronic soapbox, not restricted by access to equipment and to studios, and with plenty of airtime doled out on a first-come, first-served basis. The auspicious goal of providing free or very low-cost access to resources and airtime and to air programs without censorship of interference has proven to be a double-edged sword. All of these circumstances mentioned in my top 10 at the beginning of this story apply to the long and storied history of public access TV, although they easily apply to the current ethical and practical questions associated with social media, multiplied tenfold. Questions of fairness, equal access, religious freedom, free speech, even when it's hateful speech, decency, and free expression force themselves upon the people responsible for administering those public access channels, facilities, and resources. The additional consideration that Manhattan cable franchises were divided into two parts, effectively splitting the responsibility of serving the cosmopolitan, edgy, avant-garde producing community of Manhattan below 96th Street and the urban, gritty, ethnic, and culturally rich production community of Upper Manhattan, created a unique but complementary mix of original programming. This programming ran the gamut from pure entertainment to political to religious to adult to educational to just plain strange. This mix of programming is distinctly similar to the programming and content currently being distributed on the various social platforms available on the internet. The same sets of problems and challenges faced by producers and access channel administrators in the 80s and 90s have found their way onto the pages of New York City tabloids and into the U.S. Supreme Court today with issues surrounding Facebook and other social media outlets. The major differences between then and now are basically differences of scale. The elements I described at the beginning of this article were all genuinely new characteristics of that new phenomenon known as public access cable TV. Some other notable examples specifically include Ed Koch, the future mayor of New York City, was a regular guest on access programs on Manhattan Cable. Soon-to-be worldwide hip-hop superstars like Salt-N-Pepa, Grandmaster Flash, and Curtis Blow got their start on access in Teleprompter Manhattan's tiny uptown studio. Media icons like Spike Lee regularly dropped in on access tapings. David Letterman frequently recruited guests for his late-night network TV shows from the personalities on access shows. Most recently, congressional freshman representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez kicked off her fledgling uphill battle to Capitol Hill with frequent appearances on Bronx public access programs. The history and legacy of PEG access programming in the latter part of the 20th century tells the story of an incubator for mind-boggling questions now facing society. The right to privacy, limitations on hate speech, protection of intellectual property, the role of private, corporate players as gatekeepers, the responsibility and limitations of government over free speech, and the true democratization of mediated communication all have their roots in the chaotic days of PEG access. Looking back, maybe we can avoid making some of those same mistakes.